The ink had frozen again. Ilara pressed her thumbnail into the cork and pried it loose. The way she'd done every morning this week when the temperature dropped below what the old stove could fight off. She held the bottle close to the grate and waited. The last two coals glowed the dull red of something that had already decided to die. The ledger was open on the counter. She didn't need to look at it. She had the numbers memorized the way you memorize a bruise, not because you want to, but because it keeps finding you in the dark. Weston Creditors Association, 12 shillings, coal merchant, Hobb Street, 4 shillings, 6 pence, back rent, October through present, £1. 3 shillings, she added a new line in pencil, because the ink still wasn't moving. Hearth fuel, this week. Unknown. The shop smelled of iron and old leather and the particular cold that settles into stone walls in February and doesn't leave until May. Her father's shop. Gray's Military Supplies Letter Services. The sign outside had lost the in a windstorm 2 autumns ago. And she hadn't replaced it because it cost money and because no one who needed them failed to find them anyway. The soldiers knew. The ones who were left, along the back wall, a rack of repair tools, 3 rolls of leather strapping. A breastplate with a dent in the left side that she'd been meaning to hammer out for 6 weeks. On the shelf above the window, a row of ink bottles, a block of sealing wax the color of dried blood, a stack of military correspondence paper that she bought in bulk because it was cheaper. And because the men who came to her didn't want to write their letters home on flower-sprigged stationery. On the floor near the stove, her father's chair, not a chair. A wheelchair. The distinction mattered to him. So it mattered to her. It was a good one. She'd reinforced the left wheel twice and oiled the axle in November. He was asleep in it now, his head tipped slightly to the right. His hands resting open on the blanket across his lap, her blanket. The last one she hadn't sold or traded in December when the coal ran short. She'd folded it over his legs 3 hours ago and told herself she wasn't cold. She was cold. The ink shifted. She watched a slow dark curl move from the bow tom of the bottle and dissolve upward, and she thought, 1 more hour, maybe 2. She pulled the cork back in and set the bottle on the hearthstone and picked up the pencil instead. General Thomas Gray, retired. Age 61. Spinal injury sustained at the pass of Aldenmore. 4 years past. Unable to walk. Unable to hold a pen for more than 10 minutes without his hand shaking badly enough to make the letters unreadable. Fully alert. Heard everything. That was the part people forgot, when they came in and looked at the chair and adjusted their voices to the slow, careful register people used for the very old or the very ill. He heard everything. He just chose, with increasing frequency, not to respond. She was writing the week's correspondence schedule: 2 pension appeals, 1 letter to a widow in Hartfield. 1 notice of address change for a corporal who'd finally found work in the mills. When she heard the hoofbeats, she noticed them because they were wrong, not the neat, 4-beat rhythm of a horse under control. Something lurching, uneven, fast and then slower and then fast again. The way a horse sounds when the rider is working against it or has stopped working altogether. She set the pencil down. Through the shop window, gray street, gray sky, gray mud. The baker's boy with his cart stopped at the corner looking at something she couldn't yet see. Then the horse came around the bend, a dark bay. Sweat-lathered despite the cold, and the man on its back was not so much riding as remaining. His left arm was held against his side. His coat was army-issue wool, but the buttons were wrong, mismatched. The kind of repair you do yourself with whatever's to hand when the original buttons are lost. The horse stopped in front of her door. The man slid off rather than dismounted. He hit the mud on one knee, caught himself on his right hand, and stayed there for a moment with his head down. Then he stood. He looked up at the sign. She watched his eyes move across the letters, Gray's Military Supplies Letter Services, and he pushed the door open. The bell rang once. That he brought in cold air and the smell of iron. And something else underneath it, the particular combination of horse and long road and old blood that she associated with men who'd been traveling for several days without stopping for anything that wasn't strictly necessary. He was perhaps 30. Dark-haired. With the kind of jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a week, and eyes that were doing the things soldiers' eyes did when they came in here: the rapid inventory, corners first, then exits, then threats. And only then the person standing behind the counter, his left arm still hung wrong, "Can you still write letters here?" His voice was hoarse. Not the horse of illness, the horse of someone who hadn't spoken to anyone in long enough that the mechanism had stiffened. Elara looked at him for a moment, then she reached under the counter, found the tin cup she kept for herself, and slid it across the wood. It was half full of the tea she had been ignoring for an hour. "Not hot anymore, but warm." "Sit down," she said. "Give me the names." That he didn't ask questions about the cup. He sat on the stool across from her, the customer stool. The one with the wobbly left leg that Shed told herself she would fix and hadn't, and wrapped both hands around it, and she watched some of the careful rigidity in his shoulders release by a single degree. "That I have 8 letters." He said, "All right, some of them." He stopped. Started again. "Some of them will want to know how it happened." "I don't know how much to say." "Say what the family needs to hear," she said. "Not the same thing for everyone. You'll know when you're telling me." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression that she couldn't quite categorize, something between surprise and relief, and a third thing she didn't have a name for. "All right," he said. She opened to a fresh page and uncapped the ink. It was moving now. Thin but usable, and dipped the pen. "First name, Callum Marsh." He said it steadily. "Died at the Aldenmore Pass. His wife's name is Bridget. They have a daughter. 4 years old." He wanted a pause. He wanted Bridget to know that the last thing he talked about was the apple tree in the back garden. "Shed know what that meant," Elara wrote. She didn't look up. She had learned a long time ago that men told these things better when she wasn't watching their faces. He gave her 7 names. She wrote 7 letters, each one different in the way Head asked, some brief, some long. One that was almost entirely a list of small specific things the dead man had said about his brother's workshop and the smell of sawdust and the summer before everything. Her hand moved. The stove ticked. Her father slept. On the 8th name. His voice changed, not broke. Changed a slightly different register, the way a note sounds different when it's played on a string that's been repaired rather than replaced. "The last one," he said, "is for a retired general. He's in this town. His name is Gray." Elara's pen stopped. She was aware, in the strange suspended moment that followed, of several things simultaneously: the scratch of the nib where it had halted mid-letter, the small sound of her father shifting in his chair, and the fact that the man across from her was still speaking, still giving her the address. Not yet knowing, could not yet know that the address he was reciting was the address she was sitting in. She looked up. He was watching her with those soldier's eyes, and she could see the exact moment it arrived, the recognition, the recalculation, the slight parting of his lips. "Gray." He said again. Differently. "Yes," she said. From the chair by the stove, her father's voice came quiet, unhurried, with the particular steadiness of a man who had been awake and listening for some time. "Bring him over." She didn't move immediately. She looked at the man across the counter, at his mismatched buttons and his bad arm and his 8 letters and his long road, and she thought about the apple tree and tea. He sawdust and the 6 other families in 6 other towns who didn't yet know he was coming. Then she picked up the completed letters, tapped them square against the counter, and said, "The letters will be ready to post in the morning." She came around the counter and gestured toward the stove. He followed. Her father looked at him for a long time, not the way people looked at strangers, the quick assessment, the polite glance away. He looked the way he used to look at maps. When Elara was small and would sit under the campaign table and watch his finger trace the lines of passes and ridgelines and river crossings. Deliberate. Patient. Like a man reading something he already knew was going to be difficult. The man she still didn't know his name, she realized. 8 letters written, and she hadn't asked. Stood at a respectful distance from the chair and didn't fidget. That was something. The men who came here and felt guilty about the chair fidgeted. This one stood still with his bad arm at his side and waited. "You have something to tell me?" her father said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." From Aldenmore. A pause. "Yes, sir." Her father's hands moved on the blanket, the slow, deliberate repositioning of a man whose hands were one of the few things still fully under his control. "Sit down, then." "Elara." Pull the other stool, she pulled it. The man sat. He reached into his coat with his good arm and removed a folded piece of paper, not one of hers, something older. The paper softened and recreased many times along the same lines and held it without opening it. His name was Peter Dunn. He said. Corporal. 3rd Infantry. He was in your company for 11 months before Aldenmore. Her father closed his eyes. Just briefly. Then opened them again. That I know who Peter Dunn was. That he asked me. The man stopped. Recalibrated. He made me promise to find you specifically. He said you'd underst. And what he meant, even if it didn't make sense to anyone else. He unfolded the paper. His right hand was steady. His left, she noticed, remained against his side even when the rest of him had stopped being careful. He said to tell you, the debt about the cards is cancelled. He was cheating anyway. And you both knew it, and it doesn't matter anymore. Silence. Then her father made a sound she had not heard from him in 4 years. Not a laugh, exactly. Something smaller and more exhausted than a laugh. Something that had most of the same components but none of the energy. His head dropped forward slightly. Stupid man, he said. And it was the most affectionate thing Alara had heard him say about anyone since he came home. She stood behind the chair with her hands resting on the handles and looked at the top of her father's head and felt something shift in her chest, not painfully, just a movement. Like furniture being rearranged in a room that had been closed for a long time. The man was watching her father. He had a particular quality of attention that she was starting to identify, the kind that didn't announce itself. He wasn't staring. He was simply present in the way that meant he would remember this moment precisely, the exact quality of light and the exact sound her father had made, for a very long time. Write it down, her father said, lifting his head. He was looking at the man now. Whatever you were going to say next. Alara will write it, and I want it in my hand. Of course. Sir. She went back to the counter for paper and pen, and when she returned her father was asking the man about the approach to the past, not the battle itself, the approach, the 2 days before. The forage situation and the condition of the roads. The man answered precisely. Not like a man reciting a report. Like a man who had been there, who had walked those roads in that weather, who knew what the mud sounded like under boots in late October. She wrote what needed to be written. And she listened, and she did not yet let herself examine the feeling that had started in her chest. Later, after the man had gone and she had banked what was left of the fire. She stood in the doorway between the shop and the back room and watched her father hold the written letter in his slightly trembling hands and read it again. What was his name? She asked. The man, her father, looked up. Something passed across his face, a consideration. Brief and contained. That he didn't give you one. No, her father looked back down at the letter. Hell, come back, he said. Ask him then. That he came back on Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. That he brought a name each time, sometimes two, and she wrote the letters and he provided the contents. And her father sat by the stove and occasionally contributed details that the man would receive with a short nod. The nod of someone filing information in a place where it would be kept carefully. The 3rd Wednesday he arrived with his arm in a proper sling rather than held against his side by sheer persistence, which she took to mean he had found a physician at some point in the intervening week. Or at least someone who knew how to bind a shoulder. His name, she learned, was Leon. He offered it on the 2nd visit when she asked, without ceremony. Without the slight pause that people gave before names they were using in place of other names. Just Leon. She wrote it in the margin of her scheduling notes and didn't ask for a surname. That he was not a talker. This suited her. She had learned over years of correspondence work that the men who talked most in her shop were the ones who needed to hear themselves say the thing before they could let someone else carry it, and that was its own kind of service. But Leon arrived with the names already in order, the contents of each letter already organized. The relevant details separated from the irrelevant ones with the efficiency of someone who had done this, not the letter writing, but the thinking many times before. What he wasn't efficient about was stopping. That he wrote 8 letters in 2 hours on the 1st visit. 4 on the 2nd. 6 on the 3rd, 2 of which required consultations with her father about the specific geography of the Aldenmore approach. Which led to a conversation that ran an hour past what she'd budgeted for the afternoon, and which she did not interrupt. Because her father had begun to sit straighter during these Wednesdays. The difference was small enough that no one who didn't know him well would notice. She noticed that on the fourth Wednesday he arrived to find her on the floor behind the counter with the breastplate between her knees and a rivetin. Hammer in her hand, working on the dent she'd been meaning to address for 6 weeks. That I can come back, he said. No. Sit down. I can talk and do this at the same time. She reset the backing iron against the inside curve. Who's next? That he sat. He watched her work for a moment with an expression she couldn't see but could feel, not intrusive, just present. Thomas Hadley, he said. Gunner. Second battery. His mother is in Westwick. She doesn't read, so the letter needs to be simple sentences, short words, something she can have someone read aloud and still hear the right thing. She struck the dent lightly, testing. I know. What did he want her to know? He told her. She kept one hand on the hammer and one ear on the words and filed both away. After the letter was drafted and she'd set it aside to dry, she went back to the breastplate. He was quiet in the way that meant he was still in the room rather than waiting to leave it. The distinction had become familiar enough to name. You said the 3rd Infantry, she said. Without looking up. At Aldenmore, that's right. Them why father commanded the 7th. That I know. She set the hammer down. Not suddenly. Just set it down and looked at the breastplate, at the dent that was nearly gone now. Just a shadow of where it had been. You knew before you came here that it wasn't a question. He understood that. Yes. She picked the hammer back up. What battery were you in? She asked. A pause. The precise length of a pause that belonged to someone deciding something. That I wasn't in a battery. He said. She struck the dent again. It was almost entirely gone. No, she said. I didn't think so. She didn't push it. She set the breastplate on the counter to check the line of the curve in better light, and she wrote his answer wasn't in a battery next to the word Leon in her scheduling notes. And she kept her face turned toward the work so that he wouldn't see her thinking. The notice arrived on a Tuesday, which meant she had one day before he came again. She read it twice. Then placed it under the ledger where she wouldn't have to see it while she was working. 18 shillings and 6pence, cleared in full within 10 days. Or the lease on the shop premises would be considered forfeit and transferred to the Weston Creditors Association for reassignment. The language was careful and administrative and left no room for interpretation. She spent Tuesday evening doing the numbers again. Because she always did the numbers again, because there was a particular kind of hope that lived in arithmetic, the belief that if you arranged the same figures differently they might produce a different result. They didn't. They never did. But the process of checking was its own small discipline. And discipline was what she had instead of options. Wednesday morning she opened the shop at the usual time and put the kettle on and didn't look at the place under the ledger where the notice was. Leon arrived at 10:30. That he looked better than he had in the first weeks. The shoulder was he. Ling, the hollows under his eyes had filled in slightly, and he moved through the door with less of the careful management of a man working around pain. Had found lodging somewhere in town. She knew this because he no longer smelled of Long Road. And because once she'd seen him coming from the direction of Harrow Lane, which had 2 boarding houses and a tavern that rented rooms above the bar. He had 3 names today. She made the tea and set his cup on the counter and opened the ledger to the correspondence schedule. They were on the second letter of Corporal Fenn, whose family was in Dorset, who had wanted his younger brother to know the name of the horse had been assigned in the last 18 months of service because the brother had asked about it in every letter and Fenn had never answered, and he wanted to answer now. When the door opened, she knew the footstep before she looked up. Aldous Weston moved like a man who had learned early that his physical size was a form of argument and had been making that argument ever since. He was not large, precisely. But he used the space he occupied with a deliberateness that made him seem so. He had 2 men with him. He always had 2 men with him when he came here. Which she had once found unnerving and now found merely tedious. Miss Gray. He looked at Leon. Then at her. I wasn't aware you were taking on lodgers. I am not. He's a correspondence client. She held her pen. We're in the middle of a letter, it'll be brief. He produced a copy of the notice, his copy. The counterpart to hers under the ledger, and placed it on the counter with the flat-handed press of a man who wanted her to understand the finality of flat-handed surfaces. 10 days, as stated. I want you to understand that I take no pleasure in this, that I know you don't. She said. You take the 18 shillings. The pleasure is separate. One of the men behind him made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Weston's expression didn't change. Which meant Head decided to find it beneath his notice rather than because Head missed it. A woman running this kind of establishment alone, he began, that is running it. She kept her voice level. Has been running it for 4 years. Will continue to run it after this conversation is finished. And after your 10 days are finished, one way or another. She looked at him steadily. Are we done? He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he picked up his copy of the notice, turned, and left. His 2 men followed. The bell rang once and then the shop was quiet again. She became aware that her pen was still in her hand. She set it down, from across the counter. Leon hadn't moved. She hadn't looked at him during the exchange, and she didn't look at him now. She reached under the ledger and pulled out the notice and smoothed it once and put it on top of the ledger instead, where it was just a piece of paper among other pieces of paper. And then she picked her pen back up. Corporal Fenn, she said. The horse's name, she didn't see it happen. But in the periphery of her attention, she was aware of Leon's right hand moving toward the inner pocket of his coat, the particular reaching motion of someone about to produce something and then stopping. And then returning to the countertop. She didn't remark on it. She waited. Sergeant, he said. After a moment. The horse's name was Sergeant. She wrote it down. The Wednesday after that, they finished early. That it happened sometimes. Fewer names, shorter contents. Letters that didn't require the particular kind of silence that some of them did. By 4 o'clock she had sealed the last envelope and he had provided the last address. And there was still gray light coming through the shop window and no particular reason for either of them to move. Her father was awake tonight. Had been having a better week, less pain in the mornings. More of the particular alertness that Shed learned to distinguish from mere wakefulness. He was reading, or holding a book and thinking, which amounted to the same thing at this hour. She made a second pot of tea, which she didn't usually do. And brought his cup to him without asking whether he wanted it. He accepted it the same way. She came back to the counter and stood looking at the stack of completed letters, 6 of them this week, 9 last week. 34 in total since the first Wednesday. 34 families. 34 pieces of information that had been suspended somewhere between the living and the dead and had now been given a place to land. How many more? She asked. Leon was standing near the window. Had been doing that lately, standing rather than sitting when the work was done. As if sitting implied a stay. He hadn't decided to commit to point 11. That I know of. A pause. There may be others. Men who passed word to other men. Some of them don't know him doing this and won't find out unless someone tells them directly. So you travel between them. When I can. She looked at High's reflection in the dark shop window, imprecise, the way reflections were in old glass, slightly doubled. And when you've written the last one. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Outside, a cart went by, the horse's hooves distinct in the wet road. That I don't know. He said. I hadn't thought past it. She considered this. There was something honest in it, not the honesty of confession, but the honesty of a man who genuinely hadn't allowed himself to construct an after. Because constructing an after required a degree of confidence that things would hold together until you got there. She understood that particular economy. Why father commanded the 7th for 9 years, she said. Before Alden Moore. He never talked about the men he lost before that, not to me. Not that I heard. After he came back. She stopped. Reorganized. After he came back. He talked about almost nothing else. Not the battle. The men. Where they were from. What they'd said about their families. Things they'd told him on the march that had stored up for I don't know. For exactly this purpose. I suppose. Leon had turned from the window. He was listening with that quality she'd identified weeks ago present without pressing. That I used to think it was grief, she said. Now I think it was more like inventory. Making sure nothing was missing. Making sure every person was accounted for somewhere. Even if just in a retired general's memory. She looked at her hands on the counter. You're doing the same thing. Except you're also trying to transfer the inventory. Give it to someone who can hold it. The fire ticked. Her father turned a page. Someone told me once, Leon said, carefully. That I was too careful with things. That I measured the cost of every action so precisely that I'd stopped being able to act until the numbers were right. He paused. They weren't wrong. But at Aldenmore, I acted when the numbers weren't right, and the result, he stopped, was my father's spine. She said. Not harshly. Just the fact, named. He met her eyes. Among other things, she had known, on some level, since the fourth Wednesday. Not the specifics, not yet, but the shape of it. The careful penance of a man who had come to a town he didn't need to come to. To write letters he could have had a clerk write, to sit across from the daughter of a man whose name was at the end of his list. You came here last. She said. Of all the families. My father was last on your list. That he didn't answer. Which was itself an answer. She looked at him for a moment, at the mismatched buttons head never replaced, at the shoulder that was nearly healed. At the careful steadiness of a man holding something very heavy and making it look like standing still. Come back next Wednesday, she said. That he nodded, and the one after that. She said. Until they're finished. She started stacking the completed letters. The fire settled. Outside the light had gone entirely, and the window held nothing now but their imprecise reflections, slightly doubled. Facing each other across the dark glass, the box was at the back of the storage room. Under a canvas tarp and 2 crates of surplus leather strapping that hadn't moved since her father came home, she'd known it was there. She'd simply never had a reason to open it that outweighed the reasons not to. The reason presented itself on a Thursday evening. When old Carver came to collect his repaired pack harness and stayed 20 minutes longer than necessary, the way he always did when he had something to say that he hadn't decided whether to say, she waited him out. She'd learned this from her father. The value of a silence that didn't push. Saw your man Leon this morning, Carver said finally. Turning his hat in his hands. Coming out of the magistrate's office, she kept her eyes on the harness buckle she was checking. He's not my man. He had papers with him. Official looking. And Ridley, you know Ridley. Works the front desk. Ridley called after him. Carver paused. Called him my lord. The buckle was fine. She checked it again. Ridley's half blind and fully confused most mornings, she said. Might be. Carver put his hat on. Might not be. Just thought you'd want to know. Is all. He left. She finished with the harness. Then she stood in the middle of the shop for a moment with her hands at her sides, looking at nothing in particular. And then she went to the storage room and moved the leather strapping crates. The box was military-issue document storage, the kind used by regimental headquarters for orders, dispatches, and campaign records. Her father had brought it back with him. She'd assumed it contained pension paperwork and discharge documents, the administrative residue of a long career. She'd never looked because there had always been something more immediate to attend to. And because some part of her had understood that whatever was in it would require her full attention, and she'd never had enough of that to spare, she opened it now. The pension documents were there. As she'd expected. The discharge papers. A bundle of personal letters tied with brown cord. A campaign map of the Northern Territories, folded and refolded until the creases had nearly separated the paper into sections, and beneath all of it. A folder of operational dispatches from the Aldenmore campaign. She sat on the floor with the folder in her lap and the single lamp she'd brought in from the shop, and she read. The orders were dated, numbered, cross-referenced. She found the 7th Company's deployment orders for the 15th and 16th of October without difficulty. Her father had kept his copies annotated in his precise hand with the times of receipt and the conditions of the road and the state of the men. She read his annotations first, because his handwriting was familiar. Because it was easier, then she read the orders themselves. They were signed by the commanding officer of the Northern Campaign Division. The signature was a precise, compressed hand, the kind developed by someone who had signed a great many documents and had refined the action to its minimum necessary components. Below the signature, the rank and title, the Duke of Lennox. She sat with that for a moment, then she looked at the date of the order that had positioned the 7th Company at the Pass 1 Company, unsupported. In weather that the dispatch itself noted as deteriorating, and she looked at the date her father had annotated next to his receipt of that order, and then she looked at the date of his injury, which she knew without needing to check because some dates are not things you look up. The same week. 3 days between the order and the injury. She put the dispatches back in the folder. She put the folder back in the box. She stacked the leather strapping crates back on top of the canvas tarp. With the same care she'd used removing them, because doing things properly cost nothing extra, and she'd been raised to believe this mattered. Then she went back into the shop and sat down at the counter and looked at next Wednesday's correspondence schedule. 6 names. 2 of them new referrals. Passed along from a soldier in Westwick who had heard from a soldier in Dorset. The chain of word extending outward the way these things did when someone was doing something that needed doing. She pulled the scheduling notes toward her and looked at the margin where she'd written Leon on the 2nd visit, and below it, not in a battery, below that, in the same pencil, she wrote, the Duke of Lennox. She looked at it for a while. Then she closed the ledger. Her father was awake. She could hear him shifting in his chair. The small sounds of a man repositioning himself against the constant low-level discomfort that had become the texture of his existence. She didn't go to him. Not yet. She needed to know what she thought before she knew what he thought, because she'd learned by now that when she came to him uncertain, she left with his certainty, and this was a thing she needed to work out herself first. What she thought was this: she had written 34 letters. She had made tea 8 times. She had let him sit in her father's shop and speak to her father about men her father had known and lost. And her father had listened and asked questions, and on the night of the first letter, the night of the cards and the cancelled debt, had made that small exhausted sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him in 4 years. She had told him things about the inventory of grief. About what it meant to hold something carefully until you could give it to someone who would hold it better. And he had come here knowing. He had come here specifically, last on a list, carrying the dispatches that had put her father in that chair in some form, not directly, not by his hand, but by his name on an order on a particular October morning when the weather was deteriorating and 1 company was not enough. She sat with that until the lamp burned low, then she went to bed, and she lay in the dark. And she thought about the way Head sat on her wobbly stool and held the tea she'd given him, and how Head never once tried to tell her things were all right, and how that had been, she now realized, the most honest thing about him. Wednesday. She thought. Wednesday was soon enough. He arrived at 10:30, same as always. The letters were laid out on the counter. The ink was uncapped. The tea was on, and the shop was exactly as it had been every Wednesday for the past 8 weeks. Down to the crack of pale light that came through the gap in the left side shutter that she kept meaning to fix. She waited until Head sat down and removed his coat and picked up the first name from the list Head brought. Then she reached under the correspondence ledger and placed the dispatch fold on the counter between them. He looked at it. She watched him look at it, watched the particular quality of stillness that came over him. Not the stillness of a man who didn't understand what he was seeing, but the stillness of a man who had understood before Head finished looking. I found my father's campaign documents, she said. He kept his copies of all the operational orders. She kept her voice the same as when she was reading correspondence addresses back for confirmation, clear, measured, without inflection that would obscure the information. The order positioning the 7th Company at the pass was signed by the commanding officer of the Northern Campaign Division. She paused. The Duke of Lennox. The fire ticked. Outside, someone's cart will found the deep rut on the corner. The same rut it always found, and there was the familiar lurch and recovery. Leon did not look away from the folder. Yes, he said. 1 word. Not a denial, not an explanation, not a preamble to either. Just the direct acknowledgement of a man who had, she thought, Been waiting for this and had decided some time ago how he would meet it. She looked at him for a long moment. At the mismatched buttons. At the sling that was gone now, the shoulder healed to the point where head stopped needing to manage it visibly. Though she noticed he still favored it slightly in cold weather. At the hands that had held 34 letters with the same care, the right one steady and the left one the one Shed watched all these weeks bearing the older. Deeper kind of stillness that came from injury that had knit back together but not entirely forgotten. The order left one company at the pass. She said. Unsupported. In deteriorating weather. Yes. Father's company, yes. She let that sit for the length of time it needed to sit. Why did you come here? Not why did you come to Aldenmore? Not why did you sign the order? Those were different questions for different conversations. This one she needed answered first. That he looked up then. He met her eyes with the directness of someone who had stripped away everything that wasn't the answer. Because I Alden send a clerk, he said. I could have. Every other name on that list. I could have sent a man with a letter and a formal expression of condolence and a pension review if indicated. He paused. I came myself because it was the only thing that was actually mine to give. The time. The presence. Someone who was there. Who could answer the questions that a clerk can't answer. Another pause, shorter. And because I needed to know that your father was. He stopped, alive, she said, yes. She looked at the folder between them. At her father's annotations in the margins of his copy of the order, the time of receipt. The road conditions, the state of the men written in the precise hand of a man who had understood, even then, the importance of the record. You knew who I was before you came in. She said. You knew this was his shop, yes, and you let me write the letters anyway. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated than guilt. You offered, he said. And you were. He stopped again. This time it seemed to be a different kind of stopping. Not evasion but precision, the search for the word that was actually accurate. You were already doing the work. You already understood what it was for. I didn't want to contaminate that. By making it about what I was. Instead of what we were doing. The fire ticked. She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He didn't offer anything else and he didn't fill the silence with qualification, and that, she thought, was still the most honest thing about him. She reached across the counter and picked up the first letter from his list. You have 6 letters today, she said. Well, do the letters. She uncapped the pen. After the letters, she said, without looking up. You have 10 days to tell me everything. About the order. About the pass. About what you know and what you decided and what happened that I don't have in my father's documents. She dipped the pen. Not to explain yourself. I don't need you to explain yourself. I need to know the full inventory. All of it. So that when I decide what I think about you, am deciding about the right thing. She looked up. Met his eyes. Do you understand the difference? He held her gaze. Yes, he said. I do. Good. She smoothed the paper. First name. He looked down at his list. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of a man setting down something very heavy in a place where it could be properly examined. William Cross, he said. Sergeant. 4th Infantry. And she wrote. She waited until the following evening, not because she needed more time to think. She'd done the thinking. Or as much of it as could be done without the information she'd asked Leon to provide. She waited because asking her father required a particular quality of readiness that she'd learned couldn't be forced. He heard everything and said little. And when he did speak it tended to be the thing had been turning over for longer than she'd known it needed turning. She brought him his supper and sat in the chair she kept beside his, not opposite, beside. Because she'd noticed years ago that he talked more easily when she wasn't directly in his line of sight, and she ate her own supper and didn't say anything until the plates were empty. Leon came on Wednesday. She said that. I heard. She looked at his hands on the blanket. I found the campaign box. The operational dispatches. A pause. I know where I keep my documents. Elara, the order positioning the 7th at the pass. The signature. She kept her voice the same, not gentle, not hard. Just accurate. The Duke of Lennox. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, the wind had come up, she could hear it finding the gap in the left side shutter, the one she still hadn't fixed. Yes. Her father said. She looked at him. You knew. When he came the first time you knew who he was. Her father was quiet for long enough that she thought he might be deciding not to answer. Then he said. The first letter. Peter Dunn. He shifted slightly in the chair. Peter Dunn died 3 feet from me. I watched it happen. The man who carried him back was a lieutenant with a field commission and a torn left shoulder. And I remembered his face because he didn't have to carry Peter and he did anyway. He paused. Faces change in 4 years. But not the way a man stands. She sat with that. You recognized him by the way he stands. She said that be why the way he stood in the doorway when you told him to sit down. As if he wasn't sure he'd earned the right to yet. Her father's voice was even. Unhurried. Guilty men stand that way. Guilty men who haven't yet decided whether to keep being guilty or do something else. That he gave the order that left you at the past. That he gave an order that made sense with the intelligence he had at the time. Which turned out to be wrong. He said it with the flatness of a man who has had 4 years to locate the precise truth of something and strip it of everything that wasn't accurate. Bad intelligence. Bad weather. Bad timing. His order, yes. Also Forsyth's reconnaissance failure. And the supply officer who reported the road conditions incorrectly. And the fact that I pushed the men 2 hours further than I should have because I thought we could make the ridge before dark. A pause. It was a confluence. He was one of the currents. That he was the one with his name on the paper, yes. That's what rank means. You know that. She did know that. Shed G. Grown up knowing it. It didn't make the paper easier to hold. He's been coming here every Wednesday. She said. Writing letters. Sitting in your shop. Talking to you, talking to both of us. You let him, you let him. Her father turned his head to look at her, the careful turn of a man for whom neck movement was a calculation. I'm not the one who told him to come back the following Wednesday. And the one after that. She looked at the fire. That I didn't know who he was then. No. But you knew he was doing something that needed doing, and you knew he wasn't doing it lightly. And you decided that mattered. He turned back to the fire. I made the same decision 3 minutes after he walked in. We've been deciding the same things all along. You and I. We just hadn't told each other. She was quiet for a while. The wind found the shutter again. That he told me he came here because he couldn't send a clerk. She said. Because it was the only thing that was actually his to give. That sounds right. That it doesn't resolve the order. No. Nothing resolves the order. The order happened. You're asking him about it won't unhappen it, and his explaining it won't unhappen it. Her father's voice was tired now. The tiredness of a man reaching the end of his energy for the evening. But it wasn't defeated. What the order did is done. What he does with the fact of it, that's the part that's still happening. He closed his eyes. You asked me if I knew. Now you know I knew. Ask him the rest. That's his part to carry. Not mine. She sat for a moment longer. Then she picked up the empty plates and stood. He kept you for last, she said. On his list. He came to everyone else first. Her father didn't open his eyes. But something in the set of his face shifted slightly, not softened, precisely, but rearranged. The way a long-held position rearranges when some of the weight is redistributed. I know that too, he said. She carried the plates to the kitchen and stood at the basin for a moment with her hands in the cold water. Then she went back to the shop, sat down at the counter, and pulled the scheduling ledger open to next Wednesday's page. There was one name left on Leon's list. She'd known this since Tuesday, when he'd sent a note, formal, brief, with no salutation. Which she'd found oddly appropriate, indicating that the week's letter concerned a family in the town itself and he would bring the full details Wednesday. One name. After that, the list was finished, she picked up the pencil and wrote, in the space below the final name. Ask him about Forsyth. Ask him about the ridge, then she thought for a moment, and added. Tell him what father said. The final notice from the Weston Creditors Association arrived on a Monday. 3 days, she put it next to the original notice and looked at them both together. The arithmetic hadn't changed. The options hadn't changed. The shop had taken in 4 shillings and 8 pence. In the past week 2 correspondence jobs, 1 harness repair, 1 map copy for a merchant who needed a duplicate for his records. Against the 18 shillings and 6 pence. That was progress in the sense that a crack in a dam was progress. She was calculating whether it was worth writing to the military pension office again. She had written twice already. Both letters acknowledged and neither acted on when Dermot Crane came in. She had known Dermot since childhood. Had served under her father for 6 years and had come back from the war intact in the way that meant all his limbs were present and accounted for. Though she knew from his wife that he woke shouting 3 nights out of 7 and hadn't been inside a church since he'd come home. He was a large man who moved carefully. The way large men sometimes did when they'd learned that their size was frequently read as threat that he took off his hat when he came in. He always did, Miss Alara. He looked around the shop in the way he always looked around it, checking the corners first. Is the general in? He's resting. You can come back this afternoon if you need him. It's not him I need. He turned his hat in his hands. It was the same gesture Carver used. She wondered if it was something they'd learned in the same place. Or if it was just what hands did when men were trying to say something they hadn't finished deciding to say. It's about the man who comes Wednesdays. She kept her hands still on the ledger. What about him? I know who he is. Dermot's voice was low and even. Ridley at the magistrates told half the town by now. The Duke of Lennox. Northern Campaign Division. His jaw tightened slightly. The way it did when he was working to keep his expression neutral. He was the one commanding at Aldenmore that I know. This stopped him. He looked at her. You know, yes, and you're still. He gestured at the correspondence materials, the letters stacked neatly for collection. The ink and paper and sealing wax, all the equipment of the work they'd been doing together. He's still coming here. That he is. Dermot was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again. His voice was careful in the way of a man who was saying something he'd thought about for a long time and still wasn't certain of. The general's daughter shouldn't be providing services to the man who gave that order. It's not. He stopped. It looks wrong. She looked at him steadily. What does it look, Lee? Could to you? Like you don't know what he did. That I know exactly what he did. I've read the operational dispatches. She kept her voice even. I've also read my father's annotations on those dispatches. I know what the intelligence said and what it didn't say. I know about Forsyth's reconnaissance. She paused. My father knows who he is. My father has known since the first day he walked in here. My father has not asked him to leave. Dermot's hat had stopped turning. The general knows, yes. That he stood with that for a moment. She could see him recalculating, not the conclusion he'd come to, not yet. But the foundations it was built on, the careful re-examination of what had assumed he understood. He's writing letters, she said. To the families of the men who were at the pass. All of them. He's been doing it for 8 weeks. He's nearly finished. She looked at Dermot. Did you know Thomas Hadley? 2nd Battery, gunner. His mother is in Westwick. A pause. I knew Tom Hadley. His mother has a letter now. She can't read, so she'll need someone to read it to her. It says that in the last weeks he talked about her cooking more than anything else, specifically the way she made the bread. And that had told the other men in his unit about it until they all felt they knew the recipe. She watched Dermot's face. She has that now. Because he came here and sat on that stool and told me what Tom Hadley said, and I wrote it down. Dermot looked at the stool. The wobbly one. The customer's stool, with the left leg shed never fixed. That he didn't say anything for a long moment. That I am not telling you what to think about him, she said. I haven't finished deciding that myself. But I know what work he's doing, and I know why. And I know my father has decided it's work worth letting him do. She picked up the final notice from the creditors and put it in the box she kept for documents that required action. If you want to help with something. The lease on this shop runs out in 3 days and I'm 18 shillings short. Otherwise, I'll tell my father you stopped by. Dermot put his hat back on. He stood at the door for a moment with his hand on the frame, looking at the stool, then he said, quietly. I'll talk to some of the men. She looked up, from the 7th. He said. And the 4th. There are 8 or 9 of us in the town. We've all needed letters written at one point or another. We've been going to the office in Westwick because he stopped. Because we didn't know this was still open properly. He put his hand down from the frame. I'll talk to them. He F'd. The bell rang once. She sat for a moment in the quiet that followed, then she pulled the scheduling ledger open and turned to the page after next Wednesdays, which had been blank for weeks, and wrote at the top in ink that had finally, fully thawed. New Clients Week of the 24th. The annual remembrance was held in the Assembly Hall on the last Saturday of February, as it had been every year since the war ended. It was not an official ceremony. There was no government representative, no regimental standard. No formal order of proceedings. It had started, as far as Alara knew, because a group of veterans had needed somewhere to be on the anniversary of the battle that had taken the most men from this particular town, and the Assembly Hall had been available. And no one had told them not to. It had continued because things that meet a need tend to continue. She had attended every year since her father came home. She sat with him near the back, because the wheelchair required an aisle. And because her father preferred the back. I spent enough years at the front, had said once, and she hadn't been certain whether he meant it literally. This year was different in 2 respects. The first was that she had been asked, through Dermot, whether she would be willing to read the letters. Not all of them, the ones that had been written this year, the new ones, the ones she had written by hand on military correspondence paper over 8 Wednesday afternoons. 14 letters were represented tonight. Some of the families had come from outside the town. They would hear what their fathers and brothers and husbands had said, spoken aloud. In a room with other people who had been waiting for the same thing, she had said yes without needing to think about it. The second difference was that Leon was there. He was standing near the back wall when she arrived, in the plain dark coat he always wore, not in uniform. Not announcing himself. She had told him the previous Wednesday, when they'd finished the last letter, that she thought he should come. He hadn't asked why. Had nodded in a way that meant he understood there were several reasons and he wasn't going to make her enumerate them. The hall filled slowly. Men she recognized from years of correspondence work, the ones who came in to write home to aging par. Ents or pension offices or former commanding officers who might know of work. Men she didn't recognize who had the particular bearing of soldiers in civilian clothes. The way certain postures didn't leave you. Several women. A few older couples who were there for sons. Dermot was near the front. Had come with 2 other men she knew from the 7th Carver, who had brought the hat-turning news about Ridley and the magistrate's office. And a younger man named Price who had started coming to the shop for correspondence work 3 days ago along with 4 others from the 4th Infantry. She had filled the page after next Wednesday's. She had started a second page. She sat her father near the center aisle and took the letters from the satchel. Shed carried them in and arranged them in order. The hall had settled into the particular quiet of people who were there because something required them to be, and had run out of small talk. And were now simply present with whatever they'd brought with them. She stood, she read the first letter to a woman in the second row whose husband had been a sergeant in the 3rd Infantry. And whose name Alara had written 14 times now on envelopes addressed to families across 4 counties. She read it steadily, without performance. The letter said what it said, the specific things, the true things. The kind of detail that couldn't be fabricated because no one would know to fabricate it. She read 6 letters. She was on the 7th when the door opened and 3 men came in, late, and stood at the back. She registered them without pausing. 2 she didn't know. 1 she did. Reginald Foss. He sat on the town council and owned two of the three largest buildings on the high street and had a voice that had learned to carry in rooms without needing to be raised. She read the seventh letter and started the eighth. She was 4 sentences in when Foss spoke. I wonder, he said, and the carrying voice carried. Whether this sort of proceeding shouldn't be led by someone with a more formal connection to the regiments in question. The hall went still in the way halls went still when someone had said something that everyone had heard and no one was certain how to respond to. Elara stopped reading. She looked at Foss. He had the expression of a man who believed he was being reasonable and expected to be recognized as such. That I mean no disrespect to Miss Grey, he said. With the particular intonation of a man who was about to give a great deal of disrespect. Very careful packaging. But this is a military remembrance. There are questions of propriety. Of who speaks for these men. Officially, the hall was very quiet. Elara looked down at the letter in her hand. The 8th letter. It was for a family in Hartfield, a mother and 2 sisters whose son and brother had been a corporal in the 4th Infantry and had talked, in his last weeks, about the way the light came through the trees on the road home from his mother's house on summer evenings. And how had been trying to remember the exact quality of it because he wanted to be able to find it again after she had written that letter. She knew every word of it. She looked back up at Foss. Before she could speak, Leon moved. He had been standing against the back wall. And he came forward, not quickly, not dramatically, just with the even unhurried pace of a man who had decided to cross a room, and he stopped where the room could see him and said, in a voice that was not loud but did not require the room to be quiet in order to be heard. "Sit down." Foss turned. He registered Leon the way people registered a man in a plain dark coat who had no obvious markers of authority, which was to say with the beginning of dismissal, and then something shifted, the way things shifted when a room recalibrated. When the people who knew something communicated it to the people who didn't through the simple mechanism of their stillness. Dermot had gone very still. Carver had gone very still. The 2 men from the 4th Infantry had straightened slightly. The unconscious adjustment of men in the presence of a senior officer. "The letters she is reading," Leon said, "were given to her by the men who are in them. Not their families. Not their commanding officers. The men themselves, through the people who knew them, chose to put their last words in her keeping." He looked at Foss with the direct, unembellished attention of a man who had run out of patience for certain kinds of argument. "What she is doing tonight is not a proceeding. It is the completion of a promise." "And you interrupted it." Foss opened his mouth. "That I am Leon Grey." Leon said. "The Duke of Lennox. I commanded the Northern Campaign Division. These are my men she is reading for." He turned from Foss entirely, the completeness of the dismissal more final than any argument could have been. And he looked at Elara. "Please continue." The hall was absolutely silent. Elara looked at him for a moment. At the plain coat and the heeled shoulder and the face of a man who had just used the only thing she had asked him not to hide in the one circumstance where it was the right thing to use. She looked back down at the letter. She read it. She read the light through the trees and the road home and the quality of summer evenings that a corporal in the 4th Infantry had been trying to hold on to. She read it to his mother and his sisters, who were in the 2nd row and who were holding each other's hands, and she read it all the way to the end without stopping. When she finished the 8th letter, there was a long moment of silence. Then Dermot stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood. And then Carver stood. And the man from the 4th Infantry named Price, and then the mother from Hartfield who had just heard about the summer light. And then the hall was standing, and the noise of it was not applause exactly but something with the same function the sound a room makes when it has been holding something and can finally put it down. Elara read the remaining 6 letters, afterward. When the hall had emptied to the last few people collecting their coats, she found her father near the door. He was wearing the breastplate. She hadn't known he was going to do this. She'd left him getting ready while she went ahead to arrange the letters. And she hadn't thought to ask what he intended to wear. He had the old uniform coat over his shoulders not properly on, the sleeves empty, draped, and under it the breastplate, the one she'd spent 6 weeks intending to repair and had finally repaired, the dent hammered out. The surface restored to something close to what it had been, except for the left side, where 3 scales were still missing. She hadn't had replacement materials for those. And she hadn't wanted to substitute something that didn't match. Leon was standing beside him, she didn't know how long they'd been talking. She crossed the hall toward them and arrived in time to hear her father say, in the quiet tone he used when he was saying something that had been finished for a while, "Don't need to account to me for the order. I've done that accounting myself. But there are 3 scales missing." That he looked down at the left side of the breastplate. Leon looked at it too. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced 3 small iron scales, the exact kind. The exact size. She recognized them as military issue, the same pattern as the ones on the armor, the kind that could only have been sourced from a military supply context. Had them. Had them before tonight. She looked at him that he met her eyes briefly. And in the brief look was the acknowledgement of what this meant, that had found them, sourced them, carried them here. On the chance that tonight would be the night for them. That had been patient with the chance that he knelt down beside her father's chair. His left shoulder tightened slightly. The cold, she knew now. The healed injuries remaining response to cold, but his hands were steady. He fitted the first scale and then the second, using his thumbnail to press the small retaining clips into place. And then the third. That he sat back. The breastplate was complete. Her father looked down at it. He ran one finger along the repaired section, the slow deliberate touch of a man checking the quality of work. "There's one more thing," her father said. Leon looked up. "The first letter. The one she wrote the first night." Her father turned his head toward Alara. "You never sent it." She hadn't. Shed told herself it was because the letter had been a record of the conversation, not a proper correspondence piece. And that the moment had passed. Shed told herself a number of things about it over the weeks. It had sat at the bottom of the completed letters stack, never quite making it into the collection pile. She reached into the satchel. It was still there. Shed brought it without deciding to. The way you carried certain things without examining whether you meant to. She held it out to Leon. He rose from his kneel and took it. He looked at it, the envelope, the address in her handwriting, General Thomas Gray, Gray's Military Supplies, Harrow Road, Cowlock, and then he turned and placed it in her father's hands. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. "I should have delivered it in person from the beginning. I apologize for the delay." Her father took it. He held it in his slightly trembling hands and looked at it for a long moment, then he tucked it inside the uniform coat, in the breast pocket, where it sat against the repaired breastplate. "All right," he said. He looked at Alara. He looked at Leon. The look said several things that he apparently considered sufficiently said. Then he looked toward the door. "It's cold out. Push me home." Alara took the handles of the chair, Leon held the door, they went out into the dark together. The 3 of them, into the February cold, and the street was empty and quiet and the shop sign was visible from here. Gray's Military Supplies Letter Services, lit by the lamp Shed left burning in the window. She thought about the ledger waiting on the counter. The new page. With its new names. The ink that thawed now every morning without requiring the help of the stove. The second page. Shed started, the one that went past Wednesday. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the correspondence work. The volume isn't, one person isn't sufficient. Not anymore. No. Leon agreed, there should be a proper office. Staffed. With a formal arrangement for veterans in the district who need documentation services. She navigated the chair over the uneven cobbles at the corner. Letters, pension appeals. Discharge paperwork. The things that require someone who can read the military forms and knows which office handles what, that would require administrative support, Leon said. And a space. And someone to run it who knew what they were doing. Yes, those things are available, he said. If the person running it wanted them. She considered the lamp in the window. The sign with its missing ampersand. The shop that had been her father's and was now hers, and the way things became yours not by gift but by the daily work of keeping them alive. "Come on Wednesday," she said. Well, sort out the details. She felt, rather than saw, the particular quality of stillness that Shed learned over 8 weeks to read as his version of certain kinds of feeling, the stillness that wasn't absence but the opposite. "There's one condition," she said. "Name it." "The letters." The ones that still come, people who heard from people who heard. When they come to the office. She kept her eyes on the road. You write them yourself. I'll correct your spelling if needed, but you write them. A pause. Them why spelling is fine. He said, your looks like a you when you're tired. A longer pause. Wednesday, he said. She pushed the chair over the last corner, and the shop lamp held its small light steady in the window, and the sign was the sign it had always been. And she thought that in the morning she would get the letter repainted, because it cost something, but some things were worth the cost, and she had, at last, enough.